So, should I start?
Yes, far away.
Okay. So, thank you very much. I shall express my thanks to Tom for having provided us with this opportunity, and to all of you, of course, for your participation. Well, I hope my English won't sound too bubbling or too barbaric to you, and I'll also do my best to not get you bored at all. So in this talk tonight, we'd like to present some new insights on two passages of the Egyptian ethnography by Herodotus. These observations are discrete from one another, of course, in some immediate respects, but have a broader overarching coherence and relevance when taken as a whole. Now, from the archaic period onwards, Greek authors, including Herodotus, denoted one of the most important Egyptian city, if not the most important Egyptian city at all, by the toponym Thebai, whose etymology is still uncertain. Tonight, we'd like to explore further the possibility that Herodotus might have engaged with the local, namely Enchorial or Epicoric, so Egyptian names of this city. So we're going to start with book 2, chapter 91, as you will see on the PowerPoint. Please, next slide. So this sentence raises a problem. But there is Chemmis, a big city of the Theban north, near Neapolis. Next slide, please. So scholars broadly agree on the identification of Chemmis with the ancient Egyptian city of Khentimin, corresponding to the modern Arabic village of Akhmim, one of the major cult centers of the Ithyphallic Egyptian god Min. On the other hand, the identification of this otherwise unattested Egyptian Neapolis remains uncertain. Next slide, please. So Francis Griffith observed that Neapolis must have been an important landmark, since the toponym is mentioned without any elaboration by Herodotus, just in order to properly locate Chemmis. In line with Griffith's observation, the two previously suggested solutions, both unsupported by any material evidence, are as follows. So Alan Lloyd argued that Neapolis was a pre-Hellenistic Greek settlement later refounded as Ptolemais Ermeiou, corresponding to the modern Arabic village of Shah. Some of the material discovered at Ptolemais Ermeiou dates, of course, to Pharaonic age, but there is no indication at all that it was settled by Greeks or was of any significance before the Ptolemaic period. On the other hand, Kimbaler-Meyer argued that Neapolis corresponds to Kainepolis or Kaine, corresponding to the modern Arabic village of Qena or Kone in Coptic in Upper Egypt, on the basis of the synonymy of Ne and Kaine, both meaning new. However, Kainepolis is textually evidenced only from the 2nd century CE onwards, namely by Ptolemy. Moreover, despite the possible lexical connection between Ne and Kaine, this would raise the problem of why the toponym changed so much over time. Next slide, please. So the lectio Ne Spolios in modern editions of Herodotus is due to Stephanus Byzantinus, who interpreted Ne Spolios as the Ionic form of Nea Spoleos, which is a very popular toponomastic formulation in ancient Greek. However, a remarkable quantity of manuscripts displays the variant Ne Spolei, most probably in accordance with the phraseology proper noun in genitive plus polis, so the city of Athens, the city of Thebes, the city of London, und so weiter und so fort. So such inconsistency within the tradition is suspect for a number of reasons. So the toponym Neapolis occurs once more in Herodotus, specifically in the 7th book, referring to a town in the northeast Aegean, and it displays no traditional variants at all. The prepositional engus with a dative noun is very rare in classical Greek, but its occurrences in Herodotus are too few to draw a parallel or formulate a pattern. Moreover, the use of the phrasal typology proper noun in genitive plus polis is otherwise unattested in Herodotus. Therefore, since a confusion of declensions and thereby of case endings is unlikely, specifically dativus progenitivo or polei pro polios, one might suggest that nes polis is a lectio difficilior, or even more likely, to expunge polei as a sort of an intrusive glossa. One way or another, the toponym itself must be ne, nes in its genitive form. Next slide, please. So the phonetic similarity between ne and the Egyptian noun niut or nut into the Demotic script, which means city, and frequently in this period Thebes, is of course striking. Next slide, please. So the pronunciation of this Egyptian toponym can be reconstructed with ease through a comparative linguistic approach. So vis-a-vis its attestations in other ancient languages. Now, the Neo-Assyrian transcription displays an inner aleph, or working as a glottal stop or amza, specifically a laryngeal consonant interrupting a sequence of two distinct vowels or syllables. So the word was therefore pronounced ne'e. Please note that I is an allophone of E in the Neo-Assyrian phonology. And ne, of course, perfectly corresponds to the Greek form ne. The Imperial Aramaic transcription seemingly points to the same pronunciation, although the aleph might also stand for a mater lectionis in this case. The first solution seems to be overall the most likely, since Imperial Aramaic shows the tendency to use a different consonantal sound, so het rather than aleph, to note a long stressed E sound. The late Greek and Coptic forms display a predictable vocalic contraction due to the dropping of the inner glottal stop or hamza. In this context, the classical Hebrew form no might sound unexpected. Now, next slide, please. The classical Hebrew sound holam, a rounded long vowel, has four different origins. It might stem from a long stressed A, according to a widely known phenomenon known as Great Canaanite or simply Canaanite shift. It might stem from a long unstressed A by analogy to the aforementioned phenomenon, so the Canaanite shift. It might stem from a short stressed U in closed syllables, or it might stem from the monophthongization of an older diphthong of the kind au. So, therefore, the Egyptian toponym was originally pronounced nu'a or nu'e in classical Hebrew. The final unstressed vowel was then dropped at a certain stage, hence the development into holam of the short stressed U in closed syllables, according to the third scenario above. It should also be remarked that nua or nue would perfectly correspond to the later Neo-Assyrian form ne'e, because stressed U sounds in open syllables shift to stressed E sounds in the Egyptian language from the first millennium BCE onwards. Next slide, please. So the phonetic development of the Egyptian toponym niut or nut can be summarized as follows. At the earliest stage, let's say around the second millennium BCE or mid-second millennium BCE, the toponym was pronounced nuat or nuet. The T ending is a morphological gender marker for feminine nouns, but its inconsistent use in late Egyptian orthography, both hieroglyphic and hieratic, shows that it was not articulated at all. At this stage, the toponym was borrowed and phonetically reshaped by the Hebrew language. From the first millennium BCE onwards, Egyptian vocalic sounds changed substantially. Notably, stressed U sounds in open syllables shifted to stressed E sounds, and so nuat or nuet shifted to nea or nee, as indicated in Neo-Assyrian, Imperial Aramaic, and perhaps this Herodotian transcription. From the 3rd century BC onwards, Egyptian lost its ancient glides, or its ancient glide sounds, including the intervocalic hamzas, and this triggered many cases of vocalic contraction. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about geography. Herodotus writes that both Chemmis and Neapolis lay within the Thebaikos nomos. So a question one is supposed to address in the first place is, what does actually Herodotus mean by Thebaikos nomos? The answer lies in the following passage. So, and they said that all of Egypt except the Theban nome was a marsh, and then nothing of it remained above water of those which are now north of Lake Moeris. Basically, Herodotus fixes the northern boundary of Thebaikos nomos to the southern Fayum, which is this very small lake close to the city of Crocodilopolis on the map. Following Alan Lloyd, one might blame this on Herodotus' misconception of Upper Egyptian geography, but a more detailed analysis reveals a deep familiarity by Herodotus with contemporaneous Egyptians' conception of their own geography. Next slide, please. So Papyrus Rylands 9, a Demotic papyrus dating to the mid-5th century BCE, fascinatingly contains the same geography. And I have to read the entire text now. So Ptahses, son of Iteros, was taken before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto him, is there a good thing of which thou sayest, let it be done unto me? And Ptahses said before Pharaoh, my father was priest in the temples of the district of Thebes. The very Egyptian equivalent is Patesh and Nu. And Pharaoh called to the scribe in charge of letters, saying, write a letter to the temples of which Ptahses, son of Iteros, shall say, my father was priest in them, saying, let Ptahses be priest in them. And Ptahses, son of Iteros, was dismissed from before Pharaoh, and came south. He became priest of Arsaphes, which means Herakleopolis Magna, priest of Sukos or Sobek of Shedet, which means Crocodilopolis in the southern Fayum, priest of Amon-Re, king of the gods, which means in Thebes, priest of Osiris, lord of Ebot, which means in Abydos, priest of Onuris of Tinis, and priest of Min. So Patesh and Nu, the district of Thebes, is the Egyptian equivalent of Thebaikos nomos. And by Patesh and Nu, the author of Papyrus Rylands 9 denotes a vast area stretching from the southern Fayum southwards, just as Herodotus does. The papyrus also mentions a temple of Min in the greater Theban area, which might correspond perfectly to the temple of Min at Chemmis. Next slide, please. Finally, the use of the preposition in use, meaning near, to describe the almost 200-kilometer distance from Chemmis to Thebes is surprising, of course. For example, Lloyd questioned Armayer's identification of Neapolis with Kaine because the latter is too far from Chemmis. Two plausible explanations arise. So as we have seen, by Thebaikos nomos, Herodotus denotes a large area stretching from the Fayum downwards, rendering 200 kilometers a less dramatic distance by comparison. Furthermore, the Chemmites, whom Herodotus indicates as sources for the passage concerned with Chemmis and Neapolis, when asked by a foreigner about the relative location of their settlement, might plausibly have used a large and distinctive landmark as a point of reference. And of course, Thebes was the largest and most distinctive landmark in this case. Next slide, please. So this is significantly paralleled elsewhere in the histories. The Paeonians want to submit to the Persian Empire. Darius is willing to accept this proposal, but first he wants to collect more information about the Paeonians. And so he asks them the location of their homeland, and they respond, not far from the Hellespont. But the Hellespont is 500 kilometers far from the mouth of the river Strymon. So in summary, although Herodotus uses the toponym Thebai for the Egyptian Thebes in line with pre-existing Greek literature, the identification of his Neapolis with the Egyptian Thebes is also valid on the grounds of the linguistic evidence which I have discussed earlier, and for three broader reasons. Throughout Book 2, Herodotus engages on a variety of levels with the Egyptian language. Tom published a fascinating paper about this topic. Greek interactions with the Egyptian Thebes are archaeologically and historically attested from at least as early as the 7th century BCE, and were extensive prior to the early Iron Age. The Chemmites, who are undoubtedly Egyptian, were sources for the information in Herodotus' passage on Chemmis, and they, as Egyptian natives, may have addressed their most important and widely known city by its epicoric or by its local name, with which they must have been much more familiar than they were with Thebai. So this was my part of the speech. I now give the stage to Max. Thank you very much.
We now move backwards in Book 2 to section 15. So could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so we'd like to revisit the sentence which you see here on the slide, which has caused a lot of uncertainty in previous scholarship, and to illuminate its meaning with a comparative and historical linguistic approach. As we know, the common Greek toponym for Egypt, Aegyptos, was derived from Kut-Kap-Ptah, the house of the Ka of Ptah, which refers to the city of Memphis. The earliest surviving non-Egyptian attestation of this Egyptian term occurs in Middle Babylonian Akkadian in the form Hikuptah. Next slide, please. In his commentary, Lloyd argues that Herodotus was simply mistaken, and Ewerman later critiqued Lloyd and offered a completely different interpretation of this sentence. He was less critical of Herodotus, and he argued that Herodotus' statement stemmed from a geographical confusion part of the writer. He argued that the Greek toponym Aegyptos derives from Kut-Kap-Ptah, an Egyptian term for Memphis. Memphis itself was an intermittent seat of royal power in Egypt over the long term, and Herodotus therefore confused Memphis with Thebes as the capital city of Egypt. We argue here, however, that this sentence is attributable not to a historical or geographical confusion, since Herodotus was familiar with both Memphis and Thebes, but to a linguistic confusion, and more specifically, a phonological confusion. Next slide, please. The Egyptians diachronically had a number of endonyms for the name of their country, each with different cultural and political resonances. The most popular was Kemet, which you see here, and the diachronic development of the orthography of that name through the successive stages of the language is displayed here. Kemet has a fixed etymology from the root kem, the adjectival verb which means to be black. Herodotus seems to have been familiar with this background, describing the annual inundation of the Nile and its fertilization of the Egyptian delta, and describing the soil of the delta as the black land. The demotic orthography in the final Y displays a Memphitic dialect from the delta, from which the Bashmuric and Baharic dialects both derived. The Baharic form has a final E, reflecting the Y in the preceding demotic form, and in the southern Egyptian Sahidic Coptic, the original Memphitic Y is not kept, being replaced by an E. The continuity of Memphitic Demotic and Baharic Coptic is fundamental here, as is the initial K sound and the changes which it undergoes in Indo-European languages. So next slide, please. Displayed here is a funerary stela from Saqqara dating to the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, which bears a bilingual inscription in which the upper part is Carian and the lower part is late Egyptian hieroglyphic. The Carian text is a list of personal names, firstly the deceased, to whom the stela was dedicated, followed by his father and grandfather. The Egyptian text displays the same names transcribed into Egyptian, but with a very interesting peculiarity. The name of the grandfather is not merely transcribed phonetically, but is given an actual Egyptian equivalent in the Egyptian text, Iach, the moon. One example from a much wider range of evidence that Carians started to integrate themselves into Egyptian culture to a much greater extent than the Greeks in general did at that time, and at a comparatively early stage in the history of their presence in the country. In terms of linguistic evidence, the Carian name Rikiles, with a heavily palatalized vela in the final syllable, is transcribed in hieroglyphs as arsikre, indicating that the Egyptian K sound might be parallel to an Indo-European palatal sound. Next slide, please. We then aimed to reconstruct possible Greek pronunciations of this Egyptian toponym, Kemet. Demotic and Greek papyri from the Ptolemaic dynasty bear a few attestations of this personal name that you see, Paren Kemet or Pani Kemet, the one of Egypt, which is transcribed into Greek as displayed, pointing to a velar pronunciation of the initial K in Kemet. But in Hellenistic Greek, gamma was turning into a fricative sound, which is reflected in modern Greek. Later Grammatiki Graiki interpret that initial K as a velar fricative sound. For example, the Egyptian expression Ramech ni Kemet, a man of Egypt, corresponds to the Coptic Remen Kime or Remen Keme, and was rendered later by Hezekias as Hermokumios-ge, the land of the Egyptians. Even more interesting is Plutarch, who transliterates Kemet, the toponym, as Kinia, the K corresponding to an aspirated velar or palatal fricative sound, because it is followed by eta or upsilon. Due to ioticism, they are pronounced as an iota in modern Greek. The fricative nature of this sound is indicated by another piece of evidence in Plutarch when he renders an Egyptian F as a Greek ki. In Arabic from Chem, we have alchemia, and both words which you see on the screen kept the palatalization of the velar sound in Italian, but lost it in English. Next slide, please. The Egyptian toponym Chamet donated the locality of Medinet Habu on the west bank of Thebes from the 18th dynasty onwards. It appears as Gemma in Demotic, and different developments took place in the major Coptic dialects. The more conservative Sahidic dialect has the heavily palatal sound Kime, Keme, but in Baharic we have Shahime, an aspirated palatal sound. The Egyptian transcriptions of, the Greek transcriptions rather, of the Egyptian toponym at the bottom of the page display a pre-Coptic system of transcription, which is highly revealing. The Greek alphabet has no complete equivalent to the full Egyptian range of palatal sounds and had no letter with which to convey this particular sound, and so they used an approximation. And this is true for all Egyptian roots with this aspirated palatal sound. So the Greeks perceived ch in chamet as a fricative sound with sigma or theta. Next slide, please. German Egyptologists in general have argued that the word Thebai is an original Greek transcription of Gemma or Chamet. Ewerman is in the lower part of the slide on the screen, and the upper part displays Otto 1975 in volume 1 of the lexicon. British Egyptologists have disagreed for a number of reasons. Firstly, phonetic correspondence between Gemma and Chamet is untenable because we have attestation of Egyptian M transcribed as beta in Greek, although Egyptian M is sometimes transcribed as Semitic B and vice versa. Also, during the New Kingdom, when this linguistic borrowing is supposed to have occurred originally, as argued by Sarah Morris and others, Medinet Habu was not part of the immediate landscape of urban Thebes, but was separate, then to be much more closely integrated into the Theban area, into Thebes itself from the Saite dynasty onwards. Medinet Habu was in use over an extremely long period into Roman times and became the burial place of the Theban priesthood in the late period. It is interesting that Herodotus situates the Hecataeus episode of Book 2 in Thebes, but a more probable setting is Chamet, because the Egyptian priests in the Herodotean narrative refer to their own genealogies. There are a number of genealogies in the tombs at Chamet, and not in Karnak or Luxor, because Chamet became this burial ground of the priesthood at this time. So during the late period, Chamet and Thebes were more closely related than in earlier times. From the Ptolemaic dynasty onwards, a stronger differentiation re-emerges. Memnonia refers to Gemma and the famous colossal statues of Amenhotep III, and Thebes is called Diospolis Magna, the city of Zeus, which is the literal translation of Newton and Newton, the city of Alum, since Alum is Zeus in the Interpretatio Graeca. Next slide, please. A continuum in linguistics, of course, means that some sounds share their places of articulation in the mouth. And in Egyptian phonology, palatal sounds and velar sounds were articulated in the same region of the mouth. They formed a continuum, and this is supported by an abundance of evidence. The first part of the table, which you see, gives the etymological relationship between the Egyptian palatal sounds and Afroasiatic velar sounds, which are kept as such into Proto-Semitic and later Semitic languages. Helu becomes Chenu, which is predictable, and then Ku'ul in Aramaic, which means total or each. Egyptian has palatal sounds where Afroasiatic has velar sounds, and Egyptian has nasal sounds where Afroasiatic has liquid sounds. This is a very common pattern. In the second line there on the screen, you have Gerer or Ger, and then the Egyptian Charet, and then Chuhile, the scorpion. In the third example, you have the Afroasiatic root Gelgel, Gelgel, which becomes Jaja in Egyptian. The Egyptian Aleph was originally a liquid sound, so this was probably pronounced Gelgel or Jeje. You then have Gulgala in Aramaic and Choch in Sahidic, meaning head or skull. Further evidence emerges from late Egyptian borrowings during the New Kingdom of a number of words from Semitic languages. Velar sounds in Semitic languages are kept as such in late Egyptian, but then turn into a palatal sound in Coptic. So, for example, Migdal is a Hebrew toponym, which goes into late Egyptian as Meketer, and then you have Mechitol in Coptic. Herodotus knew this word in the form Magdalos, which fascinatingly recalls Aramaic rather than Hebrew or Egyptian phonological structure. The third item of evidence in the table is concerned with a Carian inscription from Saqqara from the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, belonging to Ekiesintes, a name of disputed etymology. It has been suggested that this is a Carian inscription, or a Carian transcription of the Egyptian name Pachsamatawi, which is also known in the Greek inscriptions at Abu Simbel in the form Potasinto. A linguistic connection between the Carian name and the Egyptian name is thoroughly tenable, pointing to a palatal pronunciation G of the Egyptian verb di, to give, and this has been preserved by the acmimic dialect of Coptic. Therefore, an original Egyptian palatal sound was transcribed by a native Carian speaker as a palatovelar sound. The acmimic dialect is local to Chemmis, and Herodotus himself was speaking to Chemites who spoke this dialect, demonstrating the connection with the toponyms in Book 2. Graphically, the Coptic letter which you see on the screen derives from that demotic sign, which in turn derives from the Egyptian uniliteral hieroglyph, the basket with handle K. Next slide, please. Demotic orthography is very useful for historical linguistics, and some Middle and Late Egyptian words were transcribed unetymologically into the demotic script in the mid-1st millennium BCE. The fundamental principle is that demotic scribes used more common or more contemporaneously popular sounds in order to convey properly the pronunciation of an older Egyptian word. And this is also true in the case of chamet, chaima, or chaime. The first character is from the verb chai, to bring, to fetch, seize, and it is kept in the Coptic language in the form chi. It is interesting that the verb chai in demotic is very frequently confused with the verb jed, to say or to speak. So how did the Greeks transcribe the verb jed, to say? Well, the first demotic name which you see takes on an aspirated bellow sound, and the second is transcribed into Old Coptic as kamentevonk, with a bellow sound. Next slide, please. So by the early classical period, therefore, the Greeks were unable to distinguish between an Egyptian bellow sound and an Egyptian palatal sound, because the two form a linguistic continuum, which is barely distinguishable both to the Greeks and to modern language speakers. So from this historical linguistic approach, we can establish that Herodotus confused hemi, chemet, and chihemi, chamet. This is why he reports that Egypt and Thebes share their names. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me all. Good. I'm going to give you a thumbs up before I get on to the other business. Thank you, both of you. That just about worked. I'm sorry for the difficulties at the beginning. And thank you in particular for a virtuoso display from the two of you on those scores. I'm not the world expert on those questions of continuum, so I'm going to hand over to other people. I'm a long way away from that, so I'm going to hope that other people have more capacity to come in on the linguistic evidence, although I'd be interested to ask some questions about the wider implications of what you said. So can I open up for questions on the narrower points, the kind of links in your argument, but on anything else as well? Anyone else, including those people who are more Egyptologically savvy than me, some of whom I can see on the screen. Won't identify you. Anyone want to come in? No, you're going to expose me in this way? It's very cruel. Someone getting some chat. So who's this? How do we ask questions? Asked Matthew. Matthew, you unmute. Would you like to unmute and ask a question? I'm taking that as a volunteer. So Matthew Skews from St Andrews. Matthew.
Hi, thanks to the paper. It was really fantastically interesting, and I don't really know much about the phonological sort of side of things, but I'm wondering whether in the course of tracing various shifts in different languages, whether this is something which you think can be used to discern the time at which different place names might become more familiar to the Greek-speaking world. So is this something, in particular in the first part of this, you were talking about specific changes in, say, the Canaanite shift or something similar. Is this something which we would be able to then use to discern the point in time at which the Greeks might have started to use some of these terms? So could we say that these are not terms that are left over from sort of earlier contacts, but instead these are truly signs of sort of renewed contacts rather than any tradition?
Well, I think I should take this. So yes, as you might know, the reconstruction of the Egyptian phonology is, is very problematic overall. But in any case, since the different pieces of attestations, I mean, thanks to different kind of documents, we are able to reconstruct the phonetic development of the most important words. And one of these is, of course, Ne, so the city of Thebes. And some of the phenomena are overall systematic, because in linguistic, a phenomenon could be deemed as systematic when it happens well, systematically. And we know that, for example, the Hebrew language borrowed a number of Egyptian words, not only place names or proper nouns, but also